Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I'm a New Zealander, so you get welcomed to two Indigenous cultures. Now, for almost every audience, apart from you, of course, I have to start with a single question, and that is, what on earth does gun control have to do with public health? Even when we introduce firearm injury prevention at our annual induction course into population health for new med students, I feel I must explain, put it in a nutshell, guns are to gun violence as the mosquito is to malaria. But even if the audience already shares Australia's national pride in its gun control laws, it can still take a real shift, to realise that gun control is actually a bog standard public health problem and an absolutely standard set of solutions. And if holistic best practice firearm injury prevention has been entrenched anywhere, it's probably here. Australia's gun controls rely on evidence-based public health policy development, but above all on the research and the advocacy required to implement those policies. Back in 1996, this country had a serious problem, and it was not just a single gun massacre. In 10 years, the country had seen 11 mass shootings with more than 100 dead. Most were killed with a semi-automatic rifle, and 2/3 of the killers were licensed gun owners firing legally held firearms. And it still surprises some to hear that 87% of those killers had no history of violent crime, and 2/3 had no history of mental illness. During those years, much of the advocacy for gun control came from the Sydney School of Public Health. A handful of advocates worked away at policy change, but with no change in sight. Their warnings fell on deaf ears. Despite reams of evidence-based research distributed to policymakers, the gun lobby simply had more influence with politicians. Finally, on the 28th of April 1996, in the Broad Arrow Cafe at Port Arthur, one young man killed 20 innocent people with just 29 bullets in the space of only 90 seconds. The final toll was 35 people shot dead and 18 seriously wounded. Later, when the killer asked if he'd got the world record for a mass shooting, he was told he probably had. In Australia, attitudes to firearms and gun laws hardened overnight. After a decade of very public gun massacres, Queen Street and Hoddle Street here in Melbourne, Strathfield Plaza in Sydney, Port Arthur wasn't the only massacre, it was simply the last straw. Australians had seen enough of men with a grudge gaining easy, mainly legal access to rapid-fire weapons originally designed for the battlefield. These are the only weapons that are capable of causing that sort of mayhem in a single site. So this cartoon is typical of the swing in public opinion. It's easy to forget. It's so easy to forget how quickly all of this happened. Just 12 days after the Port Arthur shootings, our most conservative Prime Minister for years, Prime Minister John Howard, his first major act of leadership, and by far his most popular, was to announce nationwide gun law reform. In those 12 days and in the months that followed, years of work by the public health community, by lawyers, by church and women's groups, by people in this room, suddenly paid off. Every few hours we heard our old fact sheets and articles, things we'd almost forgotten that we'd written, being cited by politicians and journalists all over the country. Plagiarism never felt so good. It was a real achievement, and we felt it at the time. Now, until then, the gun lobby in Australia had been a powerful force. During the Port Arthur debate, they admitted taking money and advice from the National Rifle Association of America. They dominated advice to government, and they ran a really energetic disinformation machine. Some gun owners also threatened violence. At one rural meeting, when John Howard defended his gun ban, for the first time in Australia, a Prime Minister was photographed wearing a bulletproof vest. The shooters, the thing is that the shooters had been marginalised by a national hardening of attitudes to firearms and their owners. They didn't realise this to begin with, but possibly they do now. Now, urged on by opinion polls showing 90 to 95% support for gun control, the federal government kept its promise and pushed through an agreement between Australia's 9 jurisdictions to enforce restrictive and uniform gun laws across the country. There was a ban on rapid-fire rifles and shotguns. A proven genuine reason was suddenly needed to possess each firearm, with self-defence specifically excluded as a genuine reason. There was a ban on private gun sales that was to compel registration, and gun owner licences and the registration details of each firearm were to be linked nationwide. Now, the states and territories also agreed that the same requirements would apply to compulsory gun owner safety training across the country, a minimum 28-day delay to require either a licence or a firearm, safe storage of both guns and ammunition in separate locked receptacles, and police powers to inspect storage at any time and cancel a licence and confiscate firearms, and to remove guns in high-risk situations. That works most of the time, but not always. In the main federal gun buyback immediately after Port Arthur, 750,000 newly prohibited semi-automatic rifles and shotguns were purchased by the government from gun owners at market value and destroyed. 6 years later, following a shooting at Monash University, the National Handgun Buyback did the same, with 68,000 handguns, that's pistols and revolvers. But what's often overlooked is that in the years after the Port Arthur massacre, tens of thousands of gun owners also voluntarily surrendered non-prohibited firearms without asking for compensation, and that was a measure of the public commitment to these policies. As a result, at least another 210,000 guns were destroyed for a total of more than 1 million firearms, and that's a very conservative estimate, probably a lot more than that. And the cost, a one-year Medicare levy of 0.2% collected about $15 from each taxpayer. To add perspective, a similar effort in the United States would require the destruction of 90 million firearms. In the 18 years before the national firearm buyback from 1979 to 1996, gun suicide and gun homicide rates were already on their way down. This was a common pattern in wealthier nations. The main firearm buyback is indicated by the vertical grey line, and then the downward slope continues. One study concluded that all types of gun death at least doubled their rates of decline. Researchers are careful to stop short of claiming that Australia's public health intervention on its own caused the drop in gun deaths. But measured against the original targets, here's what followed. The first priority declared by government was to reduce the risk of mass shootings. The second broader target was to reduce the much more common overall risk of gun death and injury. And the results, 22 years without a public mass shooting, the risk of dying by gunshot has more than halved, and no substitution of method. That's important. Murderers did not simply switch to other methods. The same was true of suicide, which makes up 3/4 of firearm-related death in Australia and is often ignored, largely by journalists who don't think that suicide by gun is worth mentioning. Or, to be fair, sometimes it's an attempt not to create copycat suicides. But one study of the rate of gun suicide found that the gun suicide rate fell by almost 80% after the buyback. The same study found that Australia is likely to have saved itself 200 deaths by gunshot and $500 million in costs each year for the past 21 years. There's still some debate about findings like these. For example, this study found that the buyback had no influence on gun homicide. And then just last year, a 20-year study in JAMA concluded that Australia's gun controls were associated with fewer gun deaths, but it wasn't possible to be certain that one caused the other. Although today's politicians almost always cite one simple contrast, 11 mass shootings in the decade before gun law reform and 0 mass shootings in the 2 decades after, no one suggests that Australia's gun problems are over. Granted, 1 million firearms were destroyed. Yet in the past 20 years, Australian arms dealers imported and sold more than 1 million new firearms. And when gun owners were forced to sell their banned semi-automatic rifles and shotguns to the government, many used the cash to buy a replacement single-shot firearm. You can see that spike on the left, straight after the gun ban. Gradually after that, sales picked up again. By mid-2015, Australians once again owned as many guns as they had before Port Arthur, in crude number terms. However, in the same 20 years, Australia's population increased by nearly a quarter. So today, on a per capita basis, our rate of registered firearms per 100 population has remained almost static, and Australians still own 23% fewer firearms than they did before the massacre. And here's a surprise. According to all the polls that asked the question, in the past 30 years, the proportion of Australian households with one or more firearms, that's households with firearms, fell by 75%. How can this be? It's because the people who bought more firearms were the same people who already had firearms. Those who own guns are buying more, while those who own no guns are becoming more numerous. This trend is international. Even Americans report a steady decline in household gun ownership over the past 30 to 40 years. These slides, by the way, come from gunpolicy.org, which is a project of the School of Public Health at the University of Sydney, and we cover 350 jurisdictions around the world. It's the biggest knowledge base on armed violence in the world, and it's run out of Australia. But now I'll turn to the Pacific, and it is not all Gauguin paintings. Across many islands, guns have emerged as a prominent vector of violence and injury and social dislocation and healthcare disruption, most recently in Bougainville, the Solomons, and mainland Papua New Guinea. Just to the north of us, inter-group and tribal disputes, once settled with bows and arrows, are often fought with assault rifles. In Papua New Guinea, firearms are common tools of intimidation and interpersonal problem solving and resource allocation. And we call that armed crime, and it's not good for public health. The PNG Medical Journal says that violent injury has become an epidemic out of control. Doctors were then treating 5,000 gunshot cases, and this was a bigger problem, they said, than HIV/AIDS. In Papua New Guinea and many other developing nations, firearm violence also brings social disadvantage. Vendors and buyers are kept away from markets, children are kept away from schools, and patients from healthcare. Gun owners are right, of course. It is not the mere presence of a gun which causes the injury. While firearms and bullets, most importantly, are the enablers, the root causes of armed violence are much deeper and long-term. Papua New Guinea's Bougainville War focused on resource conflict. It lasted 9 years and resulted in 12 to 15,000 deaths. Finally, an agreement tied to aspirations for separate national identity made gun control a first key to peace. It became the priority. It was around this time that a broad consensus emerged among Pacific stakeholders that the security and destruction of firearms were essential prerequisites for human security, good health, and prosperity. You simply cannot have a peaceful society if there are too many illicit firearms floating around. Now, for the rule of law and human rights to be re-established in Pacific conflict zones, for healthcare and other essential services to be accessible, for good work to proceed in a safe environment, illicit firearms and ammunition are seen as the most immediate impediment to recovery and redevelopment. Think how different it is to other regions. So much so that when the troops and police of the Regional Assistance Mission to the Solomon Islands arrived in Honiara in 2003, basically it was a solicited invasion but caused by gun violence, the number one priority of all the Ramsay governments, with absolutely no audible argument, it was amazing, was the immediate collection and destruction of firearms. And they did it with glee. Amid overwhelming public support, more guns were destroyed than the country even knew it had. By law, the Solomon Islands are now gun-free, and it's a country of nearly 600,000 people, an amazing laboratory in the Pacific on how to run a gun-free, the effects of running a gun-free country. We don't quite know, except we do know that there haven't been any gun homicides since then, let alone suicides. But they're not alone. In 3/4 of the countries in our region, police patrol unarmed. 5 countries and territories ban private possession of firearms. 11 of 20 Pacific countries and territories have no military, and this region has the world's highest per capita rate of firearm destruction. Remarkably, what I'm calling the Pacific Consensus for Disarmament emerged without government coordination. Our region almost unconsciously forged a new way. Island nations have both resolved in law and been actively encouraged to disarm the neighbourhood. Across the world, this bumper sticker and it's a very popular coffee mug slogan suggests the opposite. To create a civil society, to enforce peace, first add more guns. So, how does this work internationally? 7 to 8 million firearms have been sent to Iraq. The US Government Accountability Office examined just a small segment of those and reported that as many as 200,000 could be in the hands of insurgents. By contrast, here's the more Pacific approach. When he landed his soldiers in Dili, which is the capital of Australia's island neighbour Timor-Leste, the commander of our regional peace force was asked his first priority. Brigadier Mick Slater said his soldiers would disarm local gangs, the military, the police, and another gang, the politicians. In fact, everybody in Dili. And they did just that. Now, of course, anybody who comes from outside the Pacific or even knows about other countries, you must realize, and we realize, that this simply cannot work for everyone. The world's major illicit drug and arms trafficking routes bypass our region. Gang violence is not endemic, and we haven't seen a major local conflict since the 90s. But for now, at least, our regional bumper sticker reads, "An unarmed society is a polite society." Now, does anybody here remember this? You'll be showing your age. I do. Time magazine published this cover nearly half a century ago in June 1968. That's how long some Americans have been saying that deaths by gunshot should be as amenable to public health intervention as the road toll and drink driving, tobacco-related disease, and curbing the spread of HIV/AIDS. Think about it. Today's obstructions to gun control are much the same. Industry and self-interest groups focus first on denial, then the propagation of fear, and even quasi-religious arguments. We've seen all of that before. It's nothing new to the public health community to see all of that. But with gun violence, as with HIV/AIDS, waste of time notions like evil and sin and blame and retribution could be sluiced away to allow proven public health procedures. And there's a sizable audience for this. In 2006, we wrote our first 10-year study of Australia's gun law reforms. That became the single most popular article published in Injury Prevention. Then last year, The New Yorker called our 20-year study, which we published last year, one of the 5 most notable medical findings of 2016. It's now among the top 5% of articles scored in JAMA. You might remember last year, both Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton cited Australia as a gun control example worth looking at. They're dreaming, but that's another argument. We have yet to hear from Donald Trump. But even if gun violence in America gets a lot worse before it gets better, the global need right now is for more public health professionals to spend time on gun control research and advocacy. Thank you for listening.